Good morning and welcome to Moving the Needle on Wicked Problems, our podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the fight for freedom and specifically the fight for freedom in Russia. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Russia has noted that repression against dissidents, civil and political rights in the Russian Federation has reached unprecedented levels since the country's invasion of Ukraine. Between the start of the war in Ukraine in June last year, over 20,000 people have been detained for participating in largely peaceful anti-war protests, and more than 600 criminal lawsuits have been initiated against so-called anti-war activity.
Absolutely, Senator. Despite this terrible repression, many Russians continue to raise their voice and speak out. They actually put their lives on the line striving for democracy. Today, we're going to speak with one of those advocates, someone who has sacrificed a lot to seek change in Russia. Let's get to the interview.
Our guest today is the personification of a freedom fighter for human rights. Evgenia Kara-Murza is a Russian human rights activist who is advocating for human rights accountability, promoting civil society, and bringing about democratic change in the country of her citizenship and birth, Russia. She's also the wife of a political prisoner, Vladimir Kara-Murza, twice poisoned Russian opposition leader, imprisoned since the 11th of April 2022 for protesting the war on Ukraine. Thank you so much, Evgenia, for taking the time to speak with us today. And let me commend you, first of all, on your ongoing bravery and commitment. But let's go back a little bit in the past when you were growing up in post-communist Russia. What were the hopes and dreams of your generation at that time, and where and how did it all go wrong?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Senator, and it is indeed a privilege to speak on your podcast. Now, thinking about early 1990s, now it's so easy to look back and say, well, this was what was wrong, and this was a mistake, and this was yet another one. We had the same hopes and dreams as any people in the world. Like US President Ronald Reagan said in his Westminster speech, it would be cultural condescendence or worse to think that any people would choose dictatorship over democracy. Everyone wants to be free. Everyone wants to have his or her rights respected. Everyone wants to live, to have human dignity not taken away from him. So I think that our desires were the same. To say where it all went wrong is, different specialists agree on different things, but I remember one particular moment, and I think, Vladimir and I have discussed it many times, and back then as well. It was 1999, and Vladimir Putin was still prime minister. He was not yet president, he was still prime minister. And he installed a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov on the FSB building in downtown Moscow. Now, Yuri Andropov was involved in the suppression of the 1956 Hungarian uprising. He was chairman of the KGB and the sixth leader of the Soviet Union. And he was actually the one who introduced punitive psychiatry as a method of dealing with opposition, with dissidents, with Soviet dissidents in the Soviet Union. And it is to this person that Vladimir Putin installed a memorial plaque on the FSB building in downtown Moscow in 1999. So that was, I believe, a very symbolic gesture. That was not the importance of which was not fully, I think, realized back then, as was the restoration of the Soviet national anthem. The Russia, as my husband always says, is the country of symbols. These were two powerful symbols that were, I think, largely overlooked. but they already showed in what direction Vladimir Putin would lead the country later.
And so this, I imagine, the symbols and the actions of President Putin uh, sort of motivated you to become activists calling for change in Russia. Am I correct?
I think this has always been what motivated my husband.
Mm-hmm.
Vladimir is a true Russian patriot. I'm truly lucky because I've been sharing my life and am sharing my life with a true Renaissance man. He is a journalist, a historian, a documentalist, a writer, but first of all, he has always identified himself as a politician. And to him, it's, I think, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. I think he actually lives that. And I think that I became an activist out of love and admiration for my husband and all those people, all of my compatriots who have been bravely opposing the regime. And I'm talking about thousands and thousands of Russian citizens who stood up to Vladimir Putin and his atrocities committed in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion had broken out. These people are risking their lives and freedom to say no to the regime and say no to the war of aggression against our closest neighbor. And these people, I'm in awe of their bravery, and I believe that their voices need to be heard, and they deserve to be heard, and their stories deserve to be known. And my husband has been advocating for political prisoners in the Russian Federation for years, because of course, even before the full-scale invasion, we had over 300 political prisoners in the country. Political repression is not something new to us. And since Vladimir's imprisonment, I am doing my best to continue his work, advocating for these people and advocating for a change in Russia.
Now, facing all of these security challenges, I mean, the senator mentioned your husband was poisoned twice. He's now a political prisoner. What drove you and him to, especially with Vladimir going back into Russia and knowing the potential security issues and potentially be thrown in jail or even potentially killed, because that has happened obviously to people that have stood up to the regime before. What has driven you, despite all of those obstacles and security issues, to continue this fight?
The risks and challenges are there and have been there for many years, it's true. And I think that just like the war in Ukraine that really began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, this personal hell that our family has been going through began in 2015 with the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, who was my husband's close friend, and he was also the godfather of our daughter. And then 2 months after that, Vladimir himself was poisoned for the first time. So yes, the risks have been there for many years. But Vladimir believes that as a Russian politician, he has to share the risks and challenges faced by Russians back home. He believes that to him, he would not have the moral right to call on people to continue resisting the regime. He could not do that from a safe distance. He has to be there and to be part of that resistance. And this, as far as I'm concerned, I think that, since early childhood, Vladimir is a person of action. He's always wanted to be, and I believe will always want to be, fully involved, be in the middle of it all, be the change. And his experience and his knowledge is very practical. I think that I was more formed by literature, as funny as it sounds. I've always been exposed to great world literature since early childhood, and having read Leo Tolstoy, Kurt Vonnegut, Joseph Heller, Victor Hugo, Vasily Grossman, Erich Maria Remarque, I've come to understand very early in life that no people wants war. And when given a chance, every people would choose peace over war. And that the struggle for freedom, human rights, and human dignity is truly universal. That is something over these 2 years I've been traveling the world trying to continue Vladimir's work, and I've met amazing human rights fighters who come from all parts of the world, and we're all driven by the same understanding that we're pieces of the same puzzle. So I understand that we all need to do our part, because for as long as there is a regime like that in Russia, those risks and challenges will remain in place. They will not disappear. They will be here, and my family will be under extreme risks all the time. My husband will be continued to be persecuted by the regime because he will not give up his fight for freedom in Russia. So I understand that I want to do everything I can, even though I know that it is a very small part. But if every one of us does something small, the totality of these actions will bring change. I truly believe in that, and I'm just trying to do my best.
You're trying very well, and you are succeeding. Evgenia, I do want to tell you that, because your and your husband's name is not unknown in our country. As you know, both houses of parliament passed a motion granting Vladimir honorary citizenship. I want to ask you, does that move the needle in any way?
Oh, believe me, Senator, that was such an amazing show of solidarity and support that even now, when I talk about it, I have tears in my eyes. This was a beautiful and very deeply touching symbolic gesture, because you see, just like in the Soviet times, the regime in today's Russia wants to show that there is no dissidence in the country, that the entire Russian population very much supports the regime and the official narrative. And all those who oppose it, they're not against, no, they're not dissidents. They are not political opposition. They're criminals, they're spies, traitors, or insane people. The same thing was done during the Soviet times, when Soviet leaders used to say that there was no opposition in the country. The entire Soviet people stood behind its leaders. And so, Vladimir was labeled a traitor and a spy by the Russian regime. He was sentenced to 25 years of strict regime for advocating for political prisoners in the Russian Federation, for continuously opposing the regime of Vladimir Putin, and for saying no to his aggressive war against Ukraine. And by granting him honorary citizenship, Canada went and said, well, look, you think that this person is a traitor. Canada would be honored to have such a citizen. And that is so deeply touching that it makes me cry.
Well, I think when you were in the Senate, there were not many eyes that were dry, and I remember that moment distinctly. You mentioned, clearly a commonality you and I have is literature. And you mentioned all the books that you take comfort in. People outside Russia have a hard time understanding what is exactly happening in Russia. I have read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, all the big Russian writers. But I have to say that even though I try and keep up to speed, it's very hard to know what's going on inside Russia. So do you see signals of change?
Well, you see, the fact that you have trouble seeing what is happening inside the country is because the regime is doing everything to suppress any form of opposition in the country. There is no free media, no freedom of speech, no freedom of association, no freedom of assembly, no free and fair elections. All the freedoms guaranteed by democracies worldwide have been taken from the Russian people. So in this context, it's very truly hard to understand what is happening in the country because there are no free media to report on it fully. There are those media outlets who were banned in the country and were forced to leave the country. And so they're trying to cover the situation from outside, but it is, of course, extremely difficult. The same goes for human rights activists and human rights organizations that have been following the situation with political repression in the country for years. Now their work is becoming increasingly difficult because they are banned from entering the country. They're any international observers or international rapporteurs are banned from entering the country. So in this situation, it is quite easy for the regime to represent the situation as it wants it to be seen worldwide. There is nothing happening in Russia. The entire Russian population stands behind Vladimir Putin and his regime. There is no dissent, and the war in Ukraine gets full support of the population. However, the fact that over 20,000 people have been arbitrarily detained across the country since the full-scale invasion shows that even despite those atrocious repression methods used by the Russian authorities, and those repression methods include, yet again, punitive psychiatry, physical and sexual violence, and atrocious prison terms, the fact that thousands and thousands of Russian citizens still continue going out and opposing the regime, or doing it through some other methods by setting conscription centers on fire, leaving anti-war graffiti on the walls, helping young Russian men avoid mobilization, helping people avoid repression. So all of those initiatives show that there is dissent and there is opposition, even if it cannot be seen as a political force nowadays, because in totalitarian regimes,
Yeah.
and Russia today is a near totalitarian regime, mass protests happen very rarely and usually end up in bloodshed like it happened in Ukraine recently. It does not, well, the fact that there are no mass protests in, I'm sorry, not in Ukraine, I meant in Belarus, of course. And the fact that there are no mass protests today in Belarus does not mean that there is no dissent left in the country. It just means that repression is such that people are afraid, of course, because they know that they might lose their lives. Um, and I believe that the voices of those Russian citizens who continue opposing the regime despite all odds, both inside and outside of the country, need to be heard because they represent the alternative to the existing regime. And I believe that the only way that we can achieve peace and stability on that continent is if we have democracy in Russia. For as long as there is an authoritarian or totalitarian regime in the country, warmongering will continue, aggression will continue. And in order to achieve democracy in Russia, that part of Russian society that opposes the regime and wants change in the country needs to see support and solidarity of the global democratic community.
Thank you for that very fulsome glimpse, if I may call it that, into the reality of Russians who are protesting in big ways and small ways. You're certainly doing it in a big way, but I did not know about the setting of fire to conscription centers. That is an act of civil disobedience that I think we should know more about. Let's get back to Canada. My last question, Evgenia, for you. Yes, Canada has welcomed you, and I think it was a couple of years ago. Um, Vladimir has honorary Canadian citizenship. What more do you want Canada to do? Because my listeners are primarily Canadian.
I think it goes back to my idea about those anti-war and pro-democracy Russians representing an alternative to the existing regime. Recently, at the end of last year, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a resolution calling on its member states to not recognize Vladimir Putin as a legitimate head of state after this so-called election will take place in Russia in just a couple of months from now. Since actually the Russian population has not had access to a free and fair election in over 2 decades. And the last election that was recognized as free but not fair by international organizations took part in Russia in 2003. So that's over 2 decades of stolen elections. Following the 2020 referendum that basically destroyed the country's constitution and made Vladimir Putin into a czar forever, the referendum that was not recognized by the Venice Commission as legitimate, Vladimir Putin cannot be seen and treated as a legitimate head of state following any kind of so-called election in the country. Not to mention the fact that the presidential election will actually take part on occupied Ukrainian territories where people are forced to receive Russian passports very often in exchange for humanitarian aid or medication. That, again, that process cannot be seen as legitimate. And I believe that if the international community were to declare Vladimir Putin an illegitimate head of state, that would send a powerful signal of solidarity with that part of Russian population that does represent an alternative to the existing regime, a democratic, a peaceful alternative to the existing regime. So I would call Canada on. I would call Canada to join those countries who will be brave enough, and that I understand that requires an act of huge bravery from the international community to recognize someone as Vladimir Putin, with whom the international community has been resetting relations and looking for compromises and, actually helping him in some ways commit those atrocious crimes in the past. I understand that recognizing him illegitimate would be a very huge, brave step, and it requires a lot of political will and goodwill. But I call on Canada to join those countries who will have that bravery to stand up to Vladimir Putin and say, no, we do not see you as a legitimate head of state and representative of the Russian people. We want a different Russia, and we will be talking with those people who represent that different Russia.
You ask Canada to join the group of nations who will go public on denouncing the illegitimate leadership of President Putin. Who are these other nations? Has anyone sort of embraced the idea, or is it still percolating?
Well, I believe that the fact that the report on the legitimacy of the current regime in Russia on Vladimir Putin, adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and followed by the resolution calling on member states to declare Vladimir Putin as a legitimate, is a very powerful sign, a very positive sign that, and I hope that this call will be followed by member states of the Council of Europe. And I hope that other countries around the world, democratic countries, will join that call as well.
Thank you so much, Evgenia, for your time, your wisdom, your courage, your fortitude. You've left us with lots to think about, and you've left us with a specific action, which is always a political action, which is very helpful. To our listeners, please be sure to check out our podcast, send us comments, send us your suggestions for speakers, for Evgenia, questions you may have. We will continue to bring you individuals like Evgenia, who are very courageously, in their own way, trying to move the needle as we examine the ongoing challenges that our world faces in 2024. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Yet